Welcome back to Free Media. I'm Robby Soave.
And I'm Amber Duke. A Ukrainian woman, Iryna Zarutska, was gruesomely murdered on a train in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the brutal stabbing was captured on surveillance video. The alleged perpetrator, DeCarlos Brown, had 14 prior arrests, including for armed robbery, and his own mother had him involuntarily committed for schizophrenia. The murder appears to have been random and entirely unprovoked.
Conservatives have noted that this incident garnered very little national news coverage and are asking whether that's hypocritical, given how the mainstream media exhaustively covered the case of Daniel Penny, former Marine who intervened on the New York City subway to stop Jordan Neely, a mentally ill man who was threatening passengers. Now, Penny inadvertently killed Neely while placing him under a chokehold, which sparked protests that then turned the tragedy into a major national story. But now the media is covering Zarutska's murder. Here's Brian Stelter's take on CNN.
Really, over the weekend, Elon Musk, Charlie Kirk, other Trump-aligned figures succeeded in making this senseless death a symbol of big city crime. We heard President Trump asked about it yesterday when he was heading home from New York City. He didn't seem to know much about it. He said he would get briefed, and then today, Trump did know all about it. That's exactly what has happened here. This story has trickled up from local news to social media and now to the president's attention. And it's being used, as you said, Brianna, as a political symbol, with MAGA media calling for more forceful punishments and more incarceration. I have to say, some of the replies to Musk, some of the comments around this story are baldly racist, stoking fear of African Americans because this man attacked a white woman. The open racism on sites like X today, it's eye-popping. But there are also legitimate questions about this so-called career criminal, someone who had been a repeat offender. And those questions, I hope they're not lost amid all of the cesspool kind of comments on social media.
Yeah, I think the hypocrisy here is the way someone like Brian Stelter describes this story coming to national prominence as some kind of nefarious or malicious series of events where, like, oh my, we now have to cover it because conservatives are turning it into a national story, which is what happened in this case. It's national story because a lot of conservatives noticed it and talked about it on social media, but that is never applied in the other case if liberals care or pay attention to some local story and find it compelling or horrifying in some way and turn it into a big national ordeal. The framing is not, liberals pluck obscure, graphic, shocking, but not really indicative of anything, incident and make it national thing. Like, they don't describe it that way. It only gets described that way when conservatives care. I think that's the unfairness.
Yeah,
here.
Brian Stelter wasn't on CNN talking about how liberal outlets had an outsized focus on the death of George Floyd, even though the New York Times covered that 1,000 times to 1 versus this murder of the Ukrainian refugee. There's a couple of things that I find compelling about this story and why I think conservatives found it somewhat instructive about the type of crime that we're facing in America. One is the seeming randomness of the attack. Yeah. This woman sits down in front of him on the light rail and then is almost immediately stabbed in the neck. Two is that none of the bystanders seemingly stepped in to help her. She was slowly bleeding out, according to an uncensored version of the video, and everyone just kind of watches as this guy, I mean, granted, I'm sure a lot of them were afraid of him, but and I think part of that is due to perhaps the Daniel Penny effect, where sometimes you are prosecuted. And
I'm going to push back on that, but I'll let you finish your point first.
Okay.
I'm going to engage that.
Sure. And a couple of the other things, she escaped a war only to be murdered in what was supposed to be a safe place for her to be. That juxtaposition is really sad. And then also the recent events involving Democrats and left-wing commentators denying that there is a crime problem in the United States. In fact, Axios wrote an article similarly chastising conservatives for boosting this surveillance video by noting that crime is actually down in Charlotte. But then Axios Charlotte, their little spin-off local paper, actually noted in a recent article that murders are up in Charlotte. So that's the other part of it that's incredibly frustrating.
On the bystanders thing, my only quibble with that is, so I watched, and maybe you watched a longer version than I did. The version I watched, I'm always wary of clips of videos because, we're looking at it head on and the people are like sitting around her. The actual attack happens so quick and then he storms off. I would want to know if those people were actually aware of what was going on, of whose blood was what was actually going on. it's not so clear to me but maybe you saw more video footage than me. I don't know that they're fully aware that there's someone bleeding to death who's the victim of an attack, and someone does eventually help her. Now, maybe they should have intervened more quickly. Maybe it should have been obvious what's going on. But when there's a crazy person on the subway or on the metro, you probably experienced this too. I need to just get to the other side of this car as quickly as possible without knowing exactly what's going on. Yeah, From the part I saw, I was. Like, it's really confusing that what's happened is she just got stabbed.
I'm amenable to that argument, but at the same time, when you are on a subway or a bus and you see a suspicious person, like, you need to be really aware of your surroundings, and having your head down and not paying attention is not a good idea.
Yeah, but sometimes you want to just not make eye contact with them because then they launch onto you.
But being aware of your surroundings is different from making eye contact, and like any woman who's walked out at late at night knows this. But she doesn't die right away. She's actually sitting there, and she's literally bleeding to death and like grabbing her neck, and it takes a long time for people around her to notice he's dragging blood back and forth across the floor of the light rail. She's sitting there struggling, literally making her last gasp, and it just takes so long. And I think it's really a symptom of declining societal trust, and just the way that we look out for each other in society, which is not necessarily a political issue, but it really matters.
Well, and in terms of people intervening, this is a case, so this is an individual, the alleged perpetrator, DeCarlos Brown, went to prison, came back, schizophrenic. His mother realized that, had him involuntarily committed.
Yeah, and said that she could only get him committed for up to 2 weeks.
Right. So there's another case of don't ever...
Sorry, if I can add another piece of context. I just read this earlier today, that he also apparently had been checked on by police before he was engaged in schizophrenic ramblings, and the police basically said they couldn't do anything. He then called 911 himself
a couple times
to turn himself in, and they said that he was misusing 911.
Right. And that's a little bit like the Jordan Neely, who was the person who died in the Daniel Penny case, who had numerous run-ins with law enforcement and mental health services. But people who are having psychotic issues they don't follow through reliably on taking advantage of the mental health services. This is an area where I think there's maybe a greater, I think people are maybe more coming around to the idea that there's been a little bit too much deinstitutionalization or whatever it is for people who are mentally ill and causing problems. We see them on the streets of cities, and it is an issue. I don't want to, locking people up, locking everybody up who's crazy is an idea that concerns me in like a Orwellian sense. But when you see the practical harms of people who are actually crazy, not who are who are clearly having psychotic episodes and need antipsychotic medication, I want to use the least coercive means possible to deal with them, but they can't just be allowed to wreck the public space and then cause harm to people and just being like, oh, there's a resource available for you without any kind of, and you have to do it. It's just not going to solve the problem for people who are this far gone.
There's one other point I want to make in response to Brian Stelter on the hypocrisy grounds. We talked about the hypocrisy in media coverage, but I also found myself troubled by his comment that all the replies, or a large number of the replies, were racist in nature. Now, I obviously didn't scroll through and read every single one. I'm sure there's some that are. But the reason why people are focusing on race in this incident is because if you actually listen to, I think, the 40-second mark in that surveillance video, you hear him say, "I got that white girl. I got that white girl." And it's just a reality that if you are a white person, you are 80 times more likely to be killed by a black person than the reverse, meaning a white person killing a black person. And yet, in the media, people like Brian Stelter and his colleagues would cover a white person killing a black person, maybe because it's so rare, functionally, staggeringly more frequently than they would a black person killing a white person, even though the statistics bear out the opposite.
Well, psychotic people... this is an argument Freddie DeBoer has made in his writing. Psychotic people yell racist things, or like anti-Jewish things, or anti-women things, or anti-Catholic things, or they use the language of offense to get. It's not like from they're psychotic. That's what how psychotic people behave. So I don't know that it indicates anything, but I take your point for why it gets brought up. There is I think this reflects a discomfort from the mainstream media to address, handle crime that way or talk about crime that way, which I think is on one level absolutely fine because I don't want to inspire racism either. But they are happy to, I will always notice
all school shooters are white men.
That's exactly what I was going to say. They will happily endorse the idea that there's something, the unique whiteness of mass shooters
or domestic terror. They love that one.
Right. When it is violent crime is disproportionately committed by people who are low income. And because of reasons that I believe are historical racism, there are more black people who fall into that category. It doesn't, in my view, correlate with race so much as correlates with economic status, but those are overlapping factors, is my explanation for why it's that way. And it's not racist. That's about economic status.
And it just bothers me that we can't even have a conversation about it without being accused of being some white supremacist.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think you're a white supremacist,
Thank you.
Amber, but maybe there are people out there.
I'm sure there are many.
More free media right after this. Thanks for paying attention, and we'll see you next week.